Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. I am delighted to have Brad Thompson here, and we're going to be talking about his book, American Revolutionary Mind. We are in a very tough situation politically, and people have questioned, what shall I say? Many things that people took for granted have been challenged. And it is precisely at this time you need to kind of step back and look at our foundations of America. And that's what we are doing today. Okay, so welcome, Brad.
Hi, Shrikant. Thanks very much for having me, and welcome to everybody. It's great to be here, and I look forward to chatting.
Wonderful. So tell me, you're a historian. How did you get interested in history in the first place?
So, in many ways, it goes back to the time when I was a young boy. And I don't know, I think, 7, 8 years old and living in Ontario, Canada. And I read a children's book called The How and Why Wonder Book of the American Revolution. And that was the first and most important book of my life during my childhood. And it's the book that sort of changed the way I thought about the world, even at that young age. And it was the moment at which I realized I was an American born in the wrong country. And it began what became a kind of lifelong love affair with the United States. And I moved here to the United States when I was 19, but for 2 years I've only lived in the United States, and I'm delighted to say that I finally, after many decades, became a United States citizen this past summer.
Congratulations!
Yeah, thank you. And it really goes back to that book that I read as a young boy, The How and Why Wonder Book of the American Revolution. So that was the beginning of my love of American history and the American Revolution in particular. And it's what I studied in college. And strictly speaking, if I could just make one slight correction, I'm actually right now technically a political philosopher. So my PhD, which I got many years ago, was in fact in intellectual history, but I've never taught it in a history department. I have only taught it in a political science department, teaching political philosophy. So I guess you could say I do the history of political thought.
Yes, wonderful. So why America? What is special about America? Lord Acton said that, I don't remember the exact quote, but in 1776, people did not know what liberty was before 1776. So tell me, what is special about America? What is different?
So I think the first and most important thing to say about the United States of America is that it is a propositional nation. The United States was founded on the basis of ideas, of a philosophy chosen by not just the Thomas Jeffersons and John Adamses of the world, but by ordinary, everyday Americans. Alexander Hamilton, in the first essay of the Federalist Papers, once said that it had been left to the American people to make the great decision whether they would found a nation on the basis of reason reason and philosophy, or on the basis of accident and force. And of course, they chose to found their nation on the basis of reason and philosophy. And so I think that probably makes the United States different from every other nation in history, certainly up until that point in time. But I would also say the second most important thing, which makes America distinct from every other nation in history, is that not only were we a propositional nation founded explicitly on a philosophy, but that philosophy was actually put into practice by ordinary, everyday people as they lived their lives. And more specifically, what I mean by that is America, and by America now I mean going right back to when the the New World was discovered, or at least North America was discovered in the early 17th century. There has always been a frontier,
Hmm.
right? And so between 1607 and the founding of Jamestown, really up until the 20th century, there had always been a frontier in American history. So what does that mean? Well, it meant that there were always people who were living on the edge of civilization, people always who were at the very least at arm's length from government, and really any government of any sort. And so what you have is a philosophy which you might say is a philosophy of self-government combined with an existential reality of self-government. And that ethos, the ethos that was existentially um, lived out by virtue of there always being a frontier for almost 300 years of American history, um, meant that the American people not only held certain ideas, but they actually lived them. They practiced those ideas. And so it's in other words, what that means is that there was a meeting of theory and practice, which you don't always get. I mean, there are, you know, I mean, what would be another propositional nation? Well, another propositional nation would be the Soviet Union, for instance. But that was a propositional nation founded on an untrue philosophy that could not be put into practice precisely because it was untrue. Whereas the principles ultimately contained, I think, in the Declaration of Independence could in fact be put into practice and lived out by ordinary human beings precisely because they were true and that they accord with man's nature and with the requirements of human life. So, you know, in a broad sense, I'd say
Mhm.
those two things. It's the meeting of a true philosophy, which
Mhm.
I think is summed up in the principles of the Declaration of Independence, plus the existence for almost 300 years of a frontier. It's sort of, I mean, think about it this way. You could say that American life and culture was shaped when the principles of the Declaration of Independence were carried through the Cumberland Gap after the Revolution and lived out and put into practice by people like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett.
Mhm.
And by the pioneers who took their wagons over the Appalachian Mountains and then across the Mississippi into the Trans-Mississippi West. These are people who were actually living out those ideas and principles. So I would say if you had to sum up what America is about uh, with two examples, it would be those two.
Wonderful. I just want to give you, one very interesting context in which this lesson got reiterated in my mind. I studied these great books. This is Mortimer Adler's project. And I looked at these 103 great ideas. And there are two ideas which tower over the rest. And one is the idea of God, and one is the idea of state. So the interesting thing is that when you look at the entire presentation of thought on state through all these thinkers, up until the founding fathers, largely everybody held that a benevolent monarch is this ideal. So they were actually, and that has been the tradition. Founding fathers break with that. I mean, there are some precedents to that, but in terms of the number of thinkers and their influence on a place, they break with that. And so the idea of self-government is actually fairly radical given the entire kind of Western context. Um,
Yeah.
that is one part. And the second part is that just looking at, as a student of history, most of the old world, I grew up in India. Um, most of the old world, tradition sits on their chest. They're surrounded by tradition, they are drowned in tradition. just the mere fact that you are leaving all of that and going to a new place where all the past institutions and ways of doing are left behind, and whatever it is that you want to bring there on the frontier, you pretty much have to build yourself. It allows for an existential fresh start. So it's kind of that's what you're saying, right? There is kind of existential situation and there is an intellectual situation coming together.
That's exactly right. They came together, and they forged what Edmund Burke referred to as a kind of spirit of liberty when he described why the Americans were in a state of rebellion against the mother country, and he recognized that it was a combination of both ideas and the existential reality of living at arm's length from the British state. So, in think about it in these terms. In 1764, when the Sugar Act was passed, and then in the following year in 65, when the Stamp Act was passed, when we can really trace the beginning, I think, of the American Revolution, you have to remember that these people living in the New World were British. In fact, they were loyal subjects of the British Crown in 1764, 1765. They loved the British Constitution. They thought the British Constitution was the greatest in the history of the world. As I said, they were loyal subjects of the realm, and they were probably the freest people in the history of the world. So how is it and why is it that the freest people in the history of the world are going to risk all of their wealth, all of their freedom for what, by today's standards, would be a relatively minor tax, namely the Stamp Act? In fact, the Sugar Act of 1764 actually lowered the duty on imported molasses by 50%. It lowered it. So why did the Americans get upset about the Sugar Act? Well, because it was now going to be enforced, whereas the old Sugar Act was not enforced. And that's when people like John Hancock made a fortune by essentially smuggling molasses and other goods from the Caribbean. And they didn't, other than paying off customs officials, they didn't pay a tax. But so 1764, the Sugar Act is passed. It lowers the duty on molasses, but the key is that it was now going to be enforced by a new regiment of British imperial officials, customs officials, who were sent to America along with the British Army. So, in other words, it was the first time in really a century when you could say what we might call the British deep state attempted to extend its tentacles into the colonies. And then the following year, they pass the Stamp Act, which again was a relatively low tax, and in many ways, I would say it was even a legitimate tax. I mean, what was the Stamp Act? It was a tax on stamped paper issued by the government for wills and deeds, and I think these are legitimate functions of government. And so it was not an onerous tax, if you think about it. But the point is this, and this was Burke's point: the Americans had a very tight tripwire around what they considered to be their liberties or freedoms. And any attempt, even the smallest duty or tax, and even the smallest attempt to enforce these taxes, caused the Americans to rebel. And this idea of a spirit of liberty, it's hard for us in the 21st century to understand what it was, because we have lost so much of our liberty, and we have lost so much of our spiritedness in defense of that liberty. But 18th century Americans, they would brook no attempt at all to take any of their liberties. And so, that is, in many ways, that is the spirit that comes out of the combination of the ideas behind the revolution and the lived reality experienced by the Americans, in a place where the long arm of the British government did not extend for the most part, and where both provincial and local governments didn't do much other than build roads and bridges.
Uh-huh.
Right. So this is a people who, particularly if you lived on the Western frontier, these were people who just didn't experience government.
Uh-huh.
And so the spirit of liberty is a kind of jealousy,
Uh-huh.
and any attempt to take any of it triggered them in defense of their liberties, which is precisely what happened in 1765.
So that's fascinating. So let's look at it at a kind of a larger time frame. So there is a point where the British, these are British people with British culture, come here to America at one point. And then there is 1776, where we have the Declaration of Independence. There is this entire progression, entire development of the American mind, what John Adams calls, the real American Revolution. Let's talk about that entire process, because it's quite a bit from, kind of an individual reaction to an individual tax to being able to actually state the fundamental principle on which you can build a country. So what happens? What is the progression
Right.
that builds this?
Yeah. So just before he died, Thomas Jefferson described the Declaration of Independence as what he called an expression of the American mind, which means it's a summing up. And it's a summing up of ideas and moral and political principles that had been developing over the course of about 15 years before 1776. And John Adams described this period as really the heart and soul of what the revolution was all about. So John Adams once famously asked the question, what do we mean by the revolution? And his answer was, it was not the war. It was not the war for independence.
Mhm.
The real American Revolution, he said, took place in the 15 years before a shot was fired at Lexington and Concord. And so Lexington and Concord was in May of 1775. So what Adams is doing then is dating the beginning of the revolution to 1760. Right. Well, that's a curious date, because we typically date the beginning of the American Revolution to either 1764 with the passage of the Sugar Act, or 1765 with the passage of the Stamp Act. So what took place in 1760? Well, in 1760, the British government issued what were called general writs of assistance. And a writ of assistance is like a search warrant. But these general, rather than specific writs of assistance, were completely open-ended. And what that meant was that customs officials could, with a general writ of assistance, they could basically go into any building, let's say in the city of Boston, whether it was a warehouse or even a private home, and search for whatever they want. And they didn't have to demonstrate to a local magistrate that they had cause. They could just go in. And the Americans were, certainly the Bostonians, were outraged by this. And so early in 1761, John Hancock and other British merchants sued the British government against these writs of assistance. And in a very famous court trial, uh, the first real American revolutionary, James Otis, gave a stirring defense of American rights and liberties. And it's the first time that you get an argument made by Americans in defense of their natural rights. Then you have to fast forward to 1764 when, as I said, the Sugar Act was passed. And then most importantly, though, the critical moment was 1765. And 1765 was the year of the passage of the Stamp Act. And let me just go back to the John Adams quotation that I started, but I don't think I finished. And Adams said, the true American Revolution, right, was not the war, he said, but it was a revolution in the minds of the American people. And that revolution, he said, took place in the 15 years before Concord and Lexington. So when I wrote my book, I mean, that was the guiding clue for me on how to try and figure out what the American Revolution was really all about. And it's the idea that there was a moral revolution in the minds of the people. So what does that mean? How did that revolution in the minds of the people start? Well, I really do think the key year is 1765 with the passage of the Stamp Act. And when it was passed, I mean, the reaction of the British colonists living in America was immediate. It was swift and it was powerful. And there were protests up and down the seaboard from Boston down to Savannah. And the protests, some of which were actually quite violent. It was a genuine eruption of anger against the Stamp Act. And so what was the problem with the Stamp Act? The problem with the Stamp Act, as we all know, as all Americans know, is that it was a tax without colonial representation in the British Parliament. So we all know the phrase, no taxation without representation. Uh-huh. And that was the trigger for the revolution. Now, let me just pause here and I'm going to dig down a little deeper, because here is where we find the real fundamental issues. This is where the revolution in the American mind takes place. And I think it really is. It's sort of in that period between 1765 and 1775, that 10-year period. That's the most important period. Now, just remember, in 1765, as I've said, the Americans were loyal subjects of the British Crown, and furthermore, they thought that the British Constitution was the best in the history of the world. And when they rebelled against the Stamp Act, they were doing it on the basis of what they called their rights as Englishmen. Yes. Right? That's what triggered the revolution, was they thought their rights as Englishmen had been violated. But when they petitioned George III and Parliament for the restoration of their rights as Englishmen, those rights were denied. The British had, over the course of the previous let's say since the Glorious Revolution in 1689, the British had developed a new understanding of what the British Constitution is. At the heart of this new British Constitution was the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, which says that Parliament has the full authority to pass whatever laws it wants. In other words, Parliament is synonymous with the Constitution. It is the Constitution, right? Which means that it can also change the nature of the Americans' rights. Now, along with that understanding of the British Constitution was this understanding of the rights of Englishmen. Now, what did they mean by the rights of Englishmen? Well, the rights of Englishmen were the rights of a particular people at a particular place at a particular time. But the problem with both the British Constitution and this notion of the rights of Englishmen is that they were always changing, growing, evolving, and they did not provide a standard by which to determine whether the Stamp Act was constitutional or unconstitutional. So let me give you a concrete example. In 1765, when the Americans rebel against the Stamp Act, they argue that the Stamp Act was unjust and therefore unconstitutional. The British, by contrast, argued that the Stamp Act was legal and therefore constitutional. And right there, you see the heart of the conflict. And when the Americans took the position that the Stamp Act was unjust, they came to realize that the historic doctrine of the rights of Englishmen was insufficient to protect them, and that the British Constitution could no longer protect them. And so it was from that point forward, I would argue, that the Americans very quickly came to have a new understanding of their rights and of a constitution. It's from that point forward that they start to make their arguments against not just the Sugar and Stamp Acts, but against the Townshend Acts in 1767, against the Tea Act in 73, against the Coercive Acts in 74. They argued against these acts going forward on the basis not of the rights of Englishmen, but of the rights of man. Or to put it differently, to put it in the terms they used, it was those laws were violations of their natural rights.
Wow. Wow. So I just want to make sure that I understand this clearly. So what you're saying is that it's the distinction between justice and law. So what the British were saying was that this is a law that is passed by Parliament, so it is legally binding on its subjects. And Americans are saying, but that's not just. So it's
Right.
and saying that the concept of justice they were basing on natural rights of human beings, which was at conflict with the laws that are being passed by the government, by the British. And so there is a conflict. And Americans say, before this time, they were asking for was their rights as British citizens. But once they realized that the Parliament had them, could pass a law which could be unjust, they said the natural rights and the justice that proceeds from that is the primary, and and that is at conflict with the laws that are being passed by the Parliament. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the one law passed by the British Parliament that I did not mention was the so-called Declaratory Act of 1766, which was passed after the Stamp Act had been repealed. The Declaratory Act said that Parliament could make laws for the colonies, quote, in all cases whatsoever.
Wow.
Right? So what that meant was that Parliament had a kind of omniscient power over the colonies. And by the colonies, I mean the colonial legislatures. And so, and there were no limits on what laws could be passed by the British Parliament, as long as they were passed in following legal procedures. Then they were constitutional. And so the Americans, in addition to wanting to ground their rights no longer in history, but rather in nature, also made the argument, or they began what we might call a search for a new understanding of what a constitution is or should be. So the British Constitution, traditionally understood, was summed up by Lord Bolingbroke in the 1740s or 50s. And Bolingbroke described the British Constitution as an assemblage of statutory, customary laws, and it was synonymous with the extant government at any given time. So, in other words, the British Constitution was now being interpreted by the British as essentially it was the form of government that existed at any moment in time, but of course that could change over time. And it carried with it all of the statutory and customary laws that had been passed by the British Parliament.
Wow.
The Americans, beginning in, I'd say, in the late 1760s, begin a search for a new understanding of a constitution. They want a constitution that will be grounded in something permanent like their understanding of the rights of nature, right? The rights of nature are meant to be absolute, permanent, and universal. And so the doctrine of rights will now serve as that granite-like foundation for a new constitutional edifice. And eventually, the Americans are going to develop the idea of a written constitution as fundamental law, right? Because the British Constitution, of course, was not written. So when they tried to resolve the Stamp Act in 1765, nobody could pull out of their breast pocket one of these, a written constitution. And they couldn't open it up to page 23 and say, oh, yes, here's the clause of the British Constitution which declares or which establishes the Stamp Act as either constitutional or unconstitutional. That did not exist. So the Americans began in the late 1760s, they began searching for a new understanding of a constitution. And increasingly, in a remarkably short period of time, they came to reject what they had only a few years before considered to be the greatest constitution in the history of the world, namely the British.
Wow.
And so the second part of this movement, this kind of philosophic movement, was first developing the idea of the rights of nature, and then secondly, the idea of a written constitution as fundamental law.
Wow. Okay. So this is fantastic. So, I mean, the audacity of a people saying that we will design a constitution, that is remarkable, because before that, everybody depended on the tradition. Whether it was the king or the parliament, it was like the entire inertia of whatever has happened in that culture is being carried forward as the tradition. Whereas so it's like two things. One is saying, this is the vision of what we are trying to accomplish, the natural rights, and that we will figure out a way, a structure that will implement that. So it's that's a giant leap.
Yeah, and let me actually, if I could fast forward now to 1776 and the period between 1776 and 1780. This was a period of extraordinary political, constitutional experimentation, right? So in 1776, there around the world, there was no written constitution. All constitutions at that point were really defined. I mean, the word constitution for centuries before, and really going back to ancient Greece, and you can see this in Aristotle's Politics, a constitution was really synonymous with the extant form of government, with its structures and powers and procedures. That's what a constitution was. It's just whatever, it's how the government was constituted, right? But now in 1776, the Americans begin this extraordinary experiment in constitution making. And they all of the colonies, now states, with the exception of two. So there were 11 of these new revolutionary states began the process of constitution making. But imagine what it was like in 1776 in these state legislatures to draft constitutions when you had no models from which to draw, because there are no constitutions. There are no written constitutions that have existed. So they have no models, and so they started this extraordinary experiment. And what really happened was this: in the context of fighting a war against the greatest military power in the world at that time, they also had to create governments and constitutions, and they didn't know how to do it, and obviously they were rushed to do it. So what happened was most of the existing state revolutionary legislatures drafted constitutions, but the furthest seeing revolutionaries like Jefferson and Adams, they understood that you can't have legislatures drafting constitutions. I mean, the question is, who should draft the Constitution in order to make it not a written, I mean, anybody can write a written constitution. A state legislature can draft a written constitution. The question is, how do you make it the fundamental law of the land? That's the key, to make it fundamental. And to make it fundamental is, in a sense, to, as I had said that the British Constitution was grounded in history. The Americans, in a sense, want to create constitutions that you could say transcend constitutional time. They want constitutions that are fixed. And the first way to fix a constitution is to make it written. But the problem is this: if a legislature can draft a constitution, a legislature can change a constitution. And if a legislature can change a constitution at whim, then it's not a fundamental. It's not a fundamental law. So the whole process of constitutional experimentation really culminated in Massachusetts in 1780. And they had all of these other states to look back upon, all of which had drafted their constitutions through sitting state legislatures. The citizens of Massachusetts developed a two-step method by which to turn a written constitution into fundamental law. And that two-step process included, first, creating special constitutional conventions to draft a constitution. And these special constitutional conventions had one job and one job only: to draft a constitution. They were not legislatures. And so once they drafted their constitution, then they disbanded. Then the constitution would go to county ratifying conventions, or ultimately to a constitutional convention, the purpose of which is to ratify a constitution. So it's this two-step process: creating special constitutional conventions to create, and then special ratifying conventions to, in effect, sanctify, to use a religious term, the Constitution. So the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 then became really the first constitution that achieved the status of fundamentality. And eventually, over time, all of the other state constitutions then revised their revolutionary constitutions to fit that same process. And of course, the federal constitution of 1787 was drafted by a special convention, and then it was ratified by state legislatures.
Wow. How does Declaration of Independence capture the American mind and the vision of America?
Right. So I think the idea of America can be summed up in one sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Let me just make sure that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. This is all one sentence. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Now, that's all one sentence, right? It's the second sentence of the Declaration. And that one sentence is, it's many things. First, it's a précis of John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Secondly, it is a summing up of the principles that the Americans had developed between, let's say, 1760 and 1776. And as Jefferson said, it's an expression of the American mind. Now, let's parse that one long sentence. I mean, contained in this one sentence is a philosophy, is a moral and political philosophy. Well, that's it. That's it. It's a moral and political philosophy. The Declaration says we hold these truths to be self-evident. Then it follows by identifying 4 self-evident truths, which can be summed up each in one word: equality, rights, consent, and revolution. Those are the 4 core ideas of the American Revolution or of the American founding. But let's step back and think about this for a second. We hold these truths to be self-evident. I think that clause is the most important and the most eloquent. Those are the most eloquent 7 words in American history. Parse that one clause. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Well, who is the we? Who does the we represent and we hold these truths to be self-evident? The Declaration of Independence was largely written by Thomas Jefferson, but it was edited and approved by a committee of 5, which included Ben Franklin and John Adams. But it can't, the we can't be just the drafting committee of the Declaration. It also has to include every person who signed the Declaration of Independence, right? So at the very least, the we, and we hold these truths, is the Continental Congress, which passed and signed the Declaration of Independence. But the Declaration, if it is an expression of the American mind, the we must also include not just the Continental Congress, but it really has to include the American people. But then you have to ask yourself the question, well, what does it mean to say that these truths are self-evident? Are they really self-evident? Is the revolution truth, the 4th truth, is that self-evident? I don't think it is. So what does it mean to say that we hold these truths to be self-evident? What would it mean to say that a farmer living, an uneducated, hardscrabble farmer living on the western frontier of Massachusetts knows what self-evident even means? right? And so, what does self-evident even mean? A self-evident truth, as it was understood in the 17th and 18th centuries, it was a proposition where the predicate and the subject necessarily related to one another without contradiction. Like, up is not down, black is not white, in is not out, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not what these four truths are. They're not self-evident in that sense. I think what self-evident means is that they could be grasped not just by the framers of the authors of the Declaration and the signers of the Declaration, but these truths could be grasped by all American people. But the single most important word in that clause is truth. We hold these truths to be self-evident. And I think that's important because certainly in the context of the 21st century, don't forget, it is said that we live in a post-truth society. Time magazine or Newsweek, I don't know, maybe a decade ago, ran a front cover which said "Truth is dead." Like in 21st century America, we believe that Americans, or I should say, the hoity-toity intellectual class, believes that truth is subjective. That's not how American revolutionaries understood the concept truth. Truth was something that was absolute, certain, permanent, and universal. And so the concept of truth is at the heart of the Declaration of Independence. So we hold these truths to be self-evident. That is, we Americans, we hold the following four truths to be, we grasp their meaning, is what I think the Declaration is saying in its first clause. Now, should we go through the four self-evident
Yes,
truths?
please. Yeah, yes. This is fantastic. This is great. So let's just look at this sentence. Please go ahead.
All right, and well, let me actually just pause for a moment and explain to everybody who's with us today that my book is organized around the Declaration of Independence. So the full title of the book is America's Revolutionary Mind, a moral history of the American Revolution and the Declaration that defined it. And what I do in the book is I use the Declaration of Independence as a kind of ideological roadmap by which to examine the American Revolution. So there are four self-evident truths in the Declaration. I devote 2 chapters to each of the 4 self-evident truths. So 2 chapters on equality, 2 on rights, 2 on consent, and 2 on revolution. And then in the 2 chapters for each one of these 4 self-evident truths, I trace the intellectual and political history of that particular truth. Let's take equality, for instance. And so I trace the idea of equality or rights, usually going back to the late 17th century, usually going back to John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, where these ideas were first explicated. And then I trace the intellectual history of these 4 self-evident truths: equality, rights, consent, revolution. I trace their development as they cross the Atlantic and land on American shores, and then how they're developed intellectually, mostly intellectually, throughout the course of the 18th century. Leading to culminating, of course, in the Declaration of Independence. So that's how the book is organized. So yeah, so 2 chapters on each of the 4 self-evident truths. All right, so take the equality truth.
I just want to say one thing. I was thinking of sentences and history. I don't think that there is any other sentence that has been as influential in transforming the world as this sentence.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. And although I will say it has a competitor. So if that one sentence founded a nation and changed the world for the good, I can think of one sentence that changed the world for the worse. And that sentence is from each according to his ability, to each according to his need, right? Which is Marx's famous line, and of course is the principle that is the heart and soul of socialism. Um, so yeah, this sentence is, well, let me, I'll explain its importance using Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln once described the Declaration of Independence as the golden apple, which sits in the frame or the silver picture, which is the Constitution, right? So just imagine a picture of silver with gold apples sitting inside it, and that was for Lincoln the proper relationship between the principles of the Declaration and the institutions created by the Constitution. Right.
Absolutely. I want to say one more thing here.
Yeah.
And the way I think about it is that it is the vision of Jefferson, which is captured here. I mean, it draws upon a lot, but he's the one who actually put it together. And then there is a genius in Madison, in understanding the structures. The structure of government that will actually implement it. Madison is being again a short form for a whole bunch of people, but culminating in Madison is being the most articulate, the most deepest thinker on the structure. So it's like it's those two things together. But go ahead, sir.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. So, the equality truth. What does that mean? Well, it is and always has been a contested truth. So, in the 19th century, Southern slaveholders described the equality truth as a self-evident lie. And what was the argument that it was a self-evident lie? Well, it was really a sociological observation. You look out in the world and you see that there are inequalities, right? And of course that's true. You look out into the world and there are inequalities, and you see inequalities in every society. You see inequalities in socialist countries, communist countries. And when I walk into a classroom, um, there's a sense in which you could say I see nothing but inequality. I see tall, short, fast, slow, strong, weak. And when I grade their papers and exams, I see brilliant and not so brilliant. Right? So when we look out in the world, there are obvious inequalities. So how did Jefferson, Adams, and the rest, how did they understand the equality truth? Well, I think they understood equality through what I call species equality, by which I mean they meant that all human beings, despite having quantitative differences with regard to intelligence, speed, strength, and a host of other characteristics, they share what we might call qualitative similarities. All men have reason and free will. They may have them to different degrees, but they all have them, and it unifies them all as humans versus dogs and horses. So all men are equal in the sense, and ultimately what they meant, though, and this blends with the second self-evident truth, all men have rights. All men are equal in their right to be self-owning and self-governing. This is how I think they understood the equality truth. Now, I might as well answer the question before it's asked because it's going to be asked, and legitimately so. And that is, how did American revolutionaries reconcile the equality truth with the existence of slavery? Right? That's the $64,000 question. And it's obviously a difficult question uh, for lots of different reasons. Um, Now, let me begin by saying that virtually, not even virtually, every single American revolutionary and founding father believed that slavery was a necessary evil. And the emphasis has to be on the word evil, right? So in other words, their moral evaluation of slavery is that it was morally wrong. Now, let me explain the necessary part in a moment. It's also the case that at the time of the revolution, there was a whole spectrum of views on slavery and how to deal with the problem of slavery. At one end of the spectrum, there were founding fathers like John Adams, for instance, who believed and always believed that slavery was a moral wrong and that conditions permitting it should be abolished. There was also a group of American revolutionaries, like, for instance, Ben Franklin or John Jay, who had been much, who had been as much younger men living in Philadelphia or in New York City, had owned what they called at the time a house slave. That is to say, somebody who was effectively was treated as though they were a servant. But both Jay and Franklin uh, um, uh, freed their slaves. And then both Jay and Franklin became leaders in the anti-slavery movement after 1776. And then you get founding fathers like George Washington, who was born into a slave-owning family, had slaves, but then freed his slaves upon his death. Then you get to the hard cases like Jefferson and Patrick Henry, who owned slaves and never freed their slaves. And so that's the hard case, and that's the one that really has to be examined most closely. Before I do that, however, let me say this, that in my view, the Declaration of Independence is probably the single greatest document in the history of the abolitionist movement, right? There would be no American abolitionist movement without the natural rights philosophy summed up in the Declaration of Independence, right? It was the great force for ending slavery. It was the inspiration of the abolitionist movement of the 1830s. Let me also say that as a result of the Declaration of Independence, there was an anti-slavery movement that started in the North. It was an anti-slavery movement not only in the North, but actually in the South. And between 1776 and 1803, every northern state, either through court cases or through legislation, gradually abolished slavery. And even in a place like Virginia, between 1780 and 1790, 10,000 slaves were freed. And by 1810, I think there were 100,000 slaves in the United States who had been freed. So in other words, the movement was toward freedom as a result of the principles of the Declaration of Independence. And there's more one could say, like what was done at the federal level. The Northwest Ordinance, for instance, 1786, which prevented the extension of slavery into the Northwest Territory. But the real issue, the real challenge is this: why didn't why didn't they abolish? Why didn't they just simply abolish slavery? Um, and this goes to the heart of what I call the post-emancipation problem, which is, look, it's easy for us in the 21st century to judge and condemn uh, people like Thomas Jefferson for not freeing their slaves. But they viewed the situation somewhat differently. I mean, they had a real concrete problem. And the concrete problem was how do you free 2 million slaves who have not been formally educated in any way? How do you free them? Should there be compensation for slave owners? That was another question. Should be, because they were viewed as should they be compensated? And if they're not compensated, then what's the incentive for, at least for some of them, to free their slaves? That was a problem. And then if you free them, where do the slaves go? Do you expect them to stay? Do you expect them to become neighbors? Right? And the real fear that Jefferson foresaw was a race war. And Jefferson said, in a race war between whites and blacks, justice is on the side of the freed slaves. But our self-interest to stay alive will force us, to fight and kill. So what do we do? Now, in the end, I think Jefferson and the other founding fathers believed that slavery would die a natural death. And up until the 1790s, I think there was some cause to believe that slavery was a dying institution. Of course, the invention of the cotton gin changed that. But in the end, there's no question, and I do this in my book. In the end, we have to morally judge and condemn those American revolutionaries who were slaveholders who did not free their slaves. I think we have a moral obligation to do that, and I can put it in the form of a question. I can put this moral issue in the form of a question. Consider the following hypothetical. One of Thomas Jefferson's slaves escapes and spends 2 days traipsing through the Virginia forest and swamps, trying to get to the north, trying to get to freedom. Thomas Jefferson follows him on horseback. And after 2 days, Jefferson tracks him down, and these two men are now standing face to face in the middle of a forest. And it's just the two of them. Does this runaway slave have a moral right to kill Thomas Jefferson? And the answer has to be yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? That's a hard pill to swallow. To think that a runaway slave could kill the author of the Declaration of Independence. Right? But in the end, I think that is, that is the great tragedy of American history.
Yes. Yes. Absolutely. And I also like your point that considering all of this, I mean, given all of this, still Declaration of Independence is the founding document for the abolitionist movement. Because once you establish the principle, there is a movement towards increase of freedom, not only in America, but throughout the world, because it is establishing something which is foundational for civilization itself. It's a it's a statement of it identifies the nature of human beings. And so over time, it spreads. The freedom spreads.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And I don't like to speak of the Declaration's truths as a virus, but it is kind of, I mean, the equality truth and the rights truth of the Declaration is a kind of, good virus, right? That once it's unleashed on the world, because in my view, these two truths are in fact true, and they provide, and they're true because they're grounded in human nature. And once these principles have been enunciated and declared to the world, they take on a life of their own. And that's what they did. They took on a life of their own and became a force. They became a force for good, a force for justice, and a force for freedom.
Wonderful. Shall we go to the next one, which is the consent, or do you want to focus on rights? How do you want to do this?
Well, let me just, I mean, in many ways, rights is the most important of
Mhm.
of the truths. But in a sense, I've already spoken
Mhm.
of rights in what I think is the most important way, which is to contrast it with the idea of the rights of Englishmen, right? So the most important thing to understand about the Declaration's understanding of rights is that these rights are grounded in nature, in man's nature, in human nature,
Mhm.
which means that they are and should be interpreted as absolute, permanent, and universal, right? And they are such because, I mean, what makes rights natural? What makes rights natural, I think, is that they are a kind of necessary and objective requirement of human life, of human flourishing. And they provide a standard. They provide a standard of proper moral action that all of us can live by. And the concept of rights, I mean, you can think about it in a twofold way. Rights, on the one hand, are a kind of a license. It's a license to act, to to um, to act on one's natural liberty. But on the other hand, the flip side, rights are also like a fence, a barrier that is around us, that protects us from other individuals. So the concept of rights has, I think, for the founders at least, has a kind of twofold quality. But it's the important thing is that the concept of rights is grounded in nature, and it's so you can think about it in these terms. Rights are important because they are it is a necessity and a right that man should be free to choose and pursue his own values. It's necessary and right to freely exercise his rational faculty. It's necessary and right to keep, acquire, use, trade one's property. And it's necessary and right that each of us should benefit or suffer from the consequences of our actions, right? So that's, I think, the most important thing to say about the Declaration's doctrine of rights. And I'll just say one last thing about
Sure.
rights, and more particularly about the pursuit of happiness.
Mhm.
So happiness, as it was for Aristotle, and as I think it was for people like Adams and Jefferson, happiness is man's highest value, and he needs freedom to pursue that highest value. But they did not understand the pursuit of happiness to be a subjective concept. Happiness, true happiness, I mean, they understood that there was something, I mean, they used the term true happiness or real happiness as opposed to false happiness. I mean, there are all kinds of, you may be happy when you first sit down to eat an entire box of chocolates, but the second you're finished that box of chocolates, then all of a sudden you're sick. So you have not pursued your ultimate happiness because you're no longer happy. Here's the point. Happiness was the end, but virtue was the means. So they saw an important connection between moral virtue and happiness, and that there are certain virtues that one must act out in one's life in order ultimately to achieve happiness. So again, it's not this kind of floating abstraction. It's not subjective. There is a real kind of happiness that one that and a kind of long-term and permanent happiness that one can achieve, but it does require moral virtue in order to achieve it.
So this concept is it similar to Aristotle's concept of eudaimonia, where you're saying you're actually referring not to an emotion, but a state of being, a flourishing state of being where everything in your life is doing well, and being virtuous is a means to be doing that?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, without question. So Thomas Jefferson once said that the four intellectual influences on the Declaration of Independence were Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. Of those four, Aristotle, Cicero, and Locke were philosophers of happiness. All of them understood that happiness was the end of life. And I'm not saying that's not true of Sidney. It's just that he didn't write about that. But yeah, so happiness is a kind of permanent state of mind or a long-term state of mind, and it's connected to an overall understanding of eudaimonia or human flourishing.
So you want to talk about the other two, consent and revolution?
Yep. All right. So let me just read this third self-evident truth: that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. All right. You'll notice in the logical order of the Declaration's four truths, they go from the genuinely self-evident. So, I mean, of the four self-evident truths, I think maybe equality is the only one that you could say is truly self-evident. Maybe rights, but certainly by the time you get to the third and fourth self-evident truths, these are not self-evident in the way we traditionally have understood the concept of self-evident. These are complex truths. So let me give you an example of how complex the third self-evident truth is. All right, it says that to secure the, again, let me just read it again, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. All right, now parse that sentence, not even a sentence, parse the clause. That to secure these rights, full stop. That suggests that the purpose of government is to secure these rights, the rights identified in the second self-evident truth. Now, if the sole purpose of government is to protect rights, and the Declaration says there is no other purpose than the protection of rights, the Declaration of Independence does not say that the purpose of government is to promote virtue or to create or to promote the common good. It says that to secure these rights, that's the purpose of government. Now, if the purpose of government is to secure these rights, that implies a certain kind of government. It implies a limited government, the sole purpose of which is the protection of rights. Mm-hmm. Continuing, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Governments are instituted among men. That suggests that government is not natural as it was, say, for Aristotle. And for the Tories of that time, and for a long-standing tradition of conservative political thinkers who would argue that, as Aristotle put it, the polis, the city-state, is natural. Jefferson and the founders are saying that government is not natural. It's an artificial creation, right? And it also implied in what Jefferson has written here is that there was a time before there was government. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That implies that men lived in society before they created government. And he's getting this idea from Locke's second treatise. And what is that society? It's what Locke called the state of nature. Men lived in a state of nature, but the problem with the state of nature is that man's rights in the state of nature are insecure. And they're insecure largely because some men are non-rational, and because even the best of men are not good judges in their own case or in their own cause, right? So you need an independent, neutral, hopefully objective third party to adjudicate disputes between individuals in a state of nature. And that becomes the government. And then just to end the clause, it says, deriving their just powers from the consent of the government, of the governed, which means that when individuals leave the state of nature, there must be unanimous consent by all individuals in that society to agree to the creation of government, to the creation of a government, the sole purpose of which is the protection of rights. And at the heart of it is consent. Each individual has to give his or her consent. Why? Because each and every individual is a self-owning, self-governing, self-reliant individual. And which means they're all equal. What it means is that no man is by nature the ruler of another, and no man is by nature the slave of another. Right? So that's a complex, the third truth is complex, and it's made up of several components that actually are chronological. But I think the core concept there is consent. All right, finally, revolution, the revolution truth, which is the most complex. It said, the Declaration says that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute no new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. All right, let's parse that clause, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends. Now, that's interesting when it says any form of government. So that means any form of government may be destructive of the end of government, which is the protection of rights. So implied in that is the idea that republics, what they would have thought as the best form of government, could likewise be a tyrannical government. But on the flip side, if it turns out that any form of government can be destructive of those ends, it's probably also likely the case that any form of government or many forms of government, not just a republic, could be a protector of rights. So that's interesting because that suggests, for instance, that you could have a monarchy. Theoretically, you could have a monarchy, maybe not over long periods of time, not over hundreds of years, but I think it is certainly theoretically possible that you could have a monarchical form of government or an aristocracy that could be protective of the ends of government, namely man's rights. All right, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Stop right there. The people have a right to alter or abolish it. That is a tyrannical government. Now, what that means, that's that draws upon the third self-evident truth, which is consent. In other words, what it's saying is that the consent, that the people may consent to withdraw their support for a government. And when they withdraw their consent, which is what they did in 1776, that means the government is no longer legitimate once the people have withdrawn their consent. And then, but then there's a positive sense in which the word consent is being used. Continuing, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. What that means is that the people, so you have to rely on the people's consent to overturn a government, but you also have to rely on the people's consent to create a new government, right? So consent is at the heart of this government, and at the heart of consent is the doctrine of rights, and at the heart of the doctrine of rights is the metaphysical claim that all men are created equal.
Wow. Wow.
All right. All right. But here's where it gets, oh, there's so much more. Here's where it gets really interesting. So what is this right to revolution? Right? So can the people invoke the right of revolution whenever they want? All right. So everybody in this chat room right now knows that Shrikant is a crazy tax rebel, and that he's ready to move to the mountains of Idaho so he doesn't have to pay taxes anymore. And then one day, Mr. Government comes knocking on Shrikant's door, and Shrikant opens the door with a double-barrel shotgun and says, "Over my dead body, do you take 1 penny for your new tax on soda pop?" Right? Is that what the Declaration means by the right to revolution? That every time Shrikant doesn't like some act that's being passed by the government, that he can exercise his right to revolution? No, that's not what the Declaration means. That's not what the revolution truth means. Consider the next sentence. Notice that the first word of the next sentence is prudence. Prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But, and here's the key, the but is important, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. All right, so what does that mean? So every time Shrikant doesn't like some new tax that's being passed by the government, he doesn't have the right to revolution, nor is it prudent, because it's just Shrikant and his rifle. And it turns out the government has many more guns and much bigger guns than Shrikant has, right? So prudence dictates that you don't rebel whenever you feel like it. What is required, according to the Declaration, is an identifiably objective design, that's the Declaration's word, or pattern, indicating that the movement of this particular government is towards tyranny. So think about it in these terms. Was revolution justified in 1765 with the passage of the Stamp Act? The answer is no. I mean, by Jefferson's standard, I think the answer is no, because there was no design in 1765 to enslave them. The fact of the matter is, that over the course of the previous 4 decades, every now and then, every 10, every 20 years, yeah, sure, Parliament passed an act that, by the standard or principles of the Declaration, might have been unjust. But Jefferson's point here is that a one-off law does not indicate a design to enslave or a design to institute a tyranny over the people. What's required is an objectively identifiable pattern. So, Sugar Act, Stamp Act, Declaratory Act, Townsend Acts, Tea Act, Coercive Acts, Prohibitory Act, all passed within a 10-year period, indicates to Jefferson that there was a design to enslave the Americans. And therefore, in 1776, revolution was justified, but would not have been justified in 1765.
Wow. Brad, this is incredibly good. This is just amazing. Uh, so, folks, you have to read this book because the thing is that, you know, yes, America's Revolutionary Mind. I mean, one of the things that I like about the way in which founding fathers thought about this is they always thought of it as a republic if you can keep it, because it's not a one-time thing. Because as the Declaration clearly puts it, it's the individuals, it's individual people who are the prime movers in this entire system. You're creating this government in order to protect ourselves, and we are maintaining it. We are watching it through eternal vigilance, and we are taking action in response to that, scaled properly in a prudent way. But ultimately, the responsibility is with us. So what this book does is that it actually shows you where it came from. What happens is that, all of us are, people are creatures of habit, and we take good things and bad things for granted, too much of it. And understanding where these things came from and what made it possible is the only way to actually protect it in long term. So Brad, thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was just amazing, amazing presentation.